On the morning of the gala, my son didn't greet me with warmth. He didn't ask if I was ready or if I felt well in the tuxedo he had pressed into my hands. Instead, he closed the door behind us, lowered his voice so no one else could hear, and said with a sharpness that cut deeper than any blade, "Don't embarrass me tonight, Dad." That was all. No, thank you for coming. No, I'm glad you're here. Just an order, as if I were the liability he had to manage rather than the man who had once carried him on my shoulders through storms of life. The words hit me harder than I showed. They wrapped around my chest like chains, heavy, suffocating, and they followed me with every step as we walked toward that glittering hall where he hoped to shine. The tuxedo he made me wear felt like borrowed skin, starched and foreign, a costume meant to hide the man I truly was. He didn't want me in my old jacket, didn't want the rough edges of my hands to remind anyone of where he came from. To him, I was a stain he prayed the lights wouldn't catch. He walked half a step ahead, introducing me only as my father to the doorman, not with pride, not with affection, but with the same tone a man might use to explain an unwelcome guest. And I, foolishly loyal, followed, because despite his words, despite the coldness in his eyes, he was still my son. But as I adjusted my collar and looked into the mirror-lined walls of the lobby, a thought settled like iron in my bones. He feared I would humiliate him with my presence, with the truth of who I was. What he did not know, what he could not imagine, was that the night would not end with me as his shame. The night would end with the world seeing me as something he could never erase, the creator of a masterpiece, the bearer of a legacy he had tried to bury. And though he didn't know it yet, the warning he spat at me, "Don't embarrass me tonight," would be the very prophecy that unraveled his pride, because I would not embarrass him. The truth would. Friends, let me pause here for a moment. Tell me in the comments, where are you listening to this story from? Have you ever faced something similar in your own life when someone you love tried to silence you or hide who you are? Don't forget to subscribe and share this video with others. That's how you help us grow and bring more of these powerful stories to life. And now, let's continue. The hall opened before me like a world I had never been invited into, though I had built so many like it with my own hands. The chandeliers dripped with light, cascading gold across gowns that shimmered as if stitched from pride itself. Men straightened their cufflinks and adjusted their ties with gestures they had practiced 1,000 times in front of mirrors, each movement rehearsed, each smile polished. The room breathed a language of status, a language I was never meant to speak. I stood still, my shoes unfamiliar against the marble, and felt the eyes slide over me the way one might glance past a painting that didn't belong on the wall. I was present, yet invisible, tolerated in the shadows of silk and crystal. My son guided me in, not with warmth, but with control. Every introduction was the same, short, clipped, stripped of story. This is my father. Not my name. Not the legacy of years that brought me here, just a label, as if spoken quickly enough it could not stain him. The people nodded, their eyes searching me briefly, curiosity flickering before fading into disinterest. To them I was background, a figure blurred behind the shine of their own reflections. They spoke in voices filled with empty laughter, careful words that covered the air like perfume, suffocating and sweet. And I stood in the corner, my body placed deliberately at the edge of their light, a reminder that my presence was a formality, not a welcome. The weight of it pressed on me more heavily than the tuxedo that pinched my shoulders. I had built bridges that carried men like these across rivers, raised beams that held roofs above their banquets, poured foundations under halls where their laughter now rang. And yet here, in this glittering room, I was treated as though I had done nothing, as though my very life's work was only a shadow behind their grandeur. I watched as my son laughed with men who had never known sweat, as he smiled for women whose eyes carried the same judgment he now mirrored. He kept glancing toward me, nervous, as though my very stillness threatened to betray him. In that corner, beneath the chandeliers and among the murmurs, I realized something cold and sharp. My son was not afraid of me embarrassing him by word or action. He was ashamed of me simply for existing. And though he could push me into the shadows tonight, the truth of who I was, of what I had created, would not stay buried forever. The light of the chandeliers was nothing compared to the light waiting behind a curtain that had not yet been pulled. I reached for a glass of water, simple and unnoticed among the crystal goblets of wine that glittered in every hand. My fingers had barely closed around the stem before my son's hand cut across mine, quick, dismissive, as if I were a child reaching where I had no right. He didn't look at me when he did it. His eyes stayed fixed on the crowd, on the approval he so desperately craved. The gesture was small, but it struck with the force of years. A lifetime ago, those same hands had clung to mine as he stumbled through his first steps. Now they pushed me aside, embarrassed by my presence, as though my touch could stain the evening. His words followed a moment later, low enough that only I could hear. Stay out of the way. Not a request, not a plea, a command, cold and final, spoken like I was an obstacle to be managed, rather than the man who had once sacrificed sleep and blood to see him stand where he now stood. Around us, laughter echoed against the walls, cutlery clinked, and music swelled, yet all I could hear was that voice, my son's voice, shrinking me smaller and smaller, until I felt myself vanish behind the noise of the room. I withdrew into the shadows again, folding my hands so no one would notice the roughness of my skin, the lines carved by years of labor that had built the very kind of beauty this room now flaunted. The chandeliers above seemed cruel in their brilliance, as if mocking the dullness of the man below them. I caught my reflection in one of the glass displays, and for a moment I did not see a guest. I saw an intruder, tolerated but unwanted, someone my own blood had marked as a burden. And yet, under the humiliation, something stronger stirred. The disappointment pressed heavy, but it was not the kind that broke. It was the kind that hardened. For in the corner of my heart I carried knowledge my son did not. He thought me small, irrelevant, unworthy of standing beside him. But I knew the truth of what lay waiting in this hall. I knew the moment was coming, when the shadows would shift, when silence would turn into revelation, and when the father he tried to hide would be the man the world could not look away from. He wanted me out of the way. He would soon learn I had always been the way. The banquet hall spread out like a stage, every detail rehearsed for spectacle. The main table stretched beneath the chandeliers, long and gleaming, dressed in silk cloth that shimmered beneath the light. Silver cutlery lay perfectly aligned, wine glasses catching the glow like jewels. Each place card was a declaration of importance, each chair a throne for those who considered themselves makers of destiny. Laughter poured from that table in waves, sharp and polished, rising with the clinking of crystal. It was a theater of belonging, and I was not cast among its actors. My seat was not at that table. It was pushed 2 rows back, where the light dimmed into shadow, and where eyes no longer bothered to look. My card bore my name, but the placement said everything my son did not need to repeat. I was not meant to be seen. I was meant to sit quietly, a relic stored out of reach, so no one could mistake me for someone who mattered. From my place, I watched as they toasted one another, leaning close with smiles carved deep, their words weaving a tapestry of self-importance. They did not see me watching. To them, I did not exist. I sat with strangers who shifted politely in their chairs, nodding without asking questions, speaking only to fill the silence. They treated me not with cruelty, but with a kind of courtesy reserved for a man who did not belong. It was not insult. It was dismissal. That dismissal burned worse than open scorn. The distance between their table and mine was only a few steps. but it felt like a canyon carved by shame. My son laughed at the main table, tilting his head toward men in suits whose shoes had never known dust. He shone in their company, as though my absence at his side was proof of his worth. I ran my hand along the tablecloth in front of me, rough fingers brushing fabric finer than anything I had ever worn. These hands had lifted beams, laid brick, poured foundations. They had built the kind of houses where people like these lived, the kind of halls where they now feasted, and yet here they rested against linen as if they were trespassers. The people at the front table admired beauty, but they had never touched the raw earth it came from. They celebrated elegance, but had never borne its cost. The lights above seemed to shine brighter where I was absent, as if my shadow had no place beneath their radiance. Yet even in the dimness of my seat, I felt something unspoken gathering, like an ember waiting to catch. My son believed he had hidden me away, out of reach of their admiration, out of range of their applause. But I knew a secret he did not. The night's most brilliant light was not the chandeliers, nor the glittering glasses. It was still veiled, still waiting, and when it appeared, it would not glow on him. It would burn through me, and through the silence he tried to place me in. The room fell into a rhythm the moment the auctioneer's voice rose above the chatter. It rang like a bell, sharp, commanding, impossible to ignore. Each syllable sliced through the air, calling numbers, calling names, summoning hands into motion. A painting emerged first, framed in gold and praised with words that clung like perfume. Rare, timeless, priceless. The crowd leaned forward, their hunger revealed in the twitch of fingers, in the restless shifting of eyes. A hand went up, then another, and the value of the piece climbed higher and higher, as though money itself was a ladder reaching toward immortality. Applause followed each final strike of the gavel, applause not for the art itself, but for the performance of wealth. My son glowed in that applause. His smile stretched wide, not toward me, not even toward the art, but toward the crowd that clapped for him, as if he were the conductor of the night's spectacle. He laughed in the right places, nodded at the right people, his eyes gleaming each time the numbers climbed. To him, the auction was not about beauty or creation, it was about status. Every sale confirmed his place among them, proof that he belonged at the front table, that his name deserved to sit beside theirs. He basked in it, feeding on their validation like a starving man at a feast. A sculpture followed. Cold marble shaped into a figure that drew admiring sighs. The bids rose swiftly, echoing against the hall's high ceiling, and my son's chest swelled as if each number added not to the price, but to his own worth. Then came a necklace, glittering under the chandelier's light, a string of stones so polished they looked like frozen stars. Again, hands lifted, voices called, the gavel fell, and more applause filled the air. The cycle repeated, over and over, each item transforming into another chance for my son to shine in the reflected glow of their wealth. But from where I sat, 2 rows back, I saw it differently. I watched the hands rise not with awe, but with something darker, an understanding of how hollow it all was. These were not works born of sweat, not visions carved out of hardship, not creations built from the ache of hands that bled to give them form. They were trophies, purchased not to be cherished but to be displayed. And my son, intoxicated by the spectacle, didn't see the emptiness in their eyes. He saw only power, and he mistook it for belonging. The sound of the gavel echoed in my chest like a warning. Each strike drew us closer, not to their triumph, but to a revelation none of them expected. My son believed this was his world, that the rhythm of the auction was his music, that he was the rising note in a symphony of wealth. But I knew differently. I knew the centerpiece had not yet been revealed. I knew the silence before its unveiling would hush the room in a way no marble or necklace ever could. And when that moment arrived, his smile would falter, his laughter would dry, and the truth, my truth, would thunder louder than any gavel. I watched him move through that room like a man rehearsing for a role he desperately wanted to keep. Every gesture was polished, every word chosen to sound like it belonged among the velvet and crystal. But in all his movements, in all his carefully constructed sentences, there was one thing he never gave me: acknowledgement. He introduced me only as my father, never more. He never spoke of the nights I worked until my hands split open, the mornings I rose before the sun to lay foundations, the years I spent breathing in dust, steel, and fire, just so he could grow up under a roof that never leaked. Instead, he let them think I was ordinary, that I was no more than a shadow tagging along, an aging man in a tuxedo too stiff for his body. That silence, that refusal to name me for who I was, cut deeper than if he had called me nothing at all. It is one thing to be insulted by strangers. It is another to be erased by your own blood. His silence told a story more cruel than words, that he was ashamed of where he came from, ashamed of the man who had raised him, ashamed of the hands that had shaped the world he now walked upon so proudly. Every time he laughed with his peers and never turned back to me, I felt the years of sacrifice buried further beneath his ambition. He wanted to stand taller, and to do that, he pushed me deeper into the ground, as if my name were a stone he had to climb over to reach his throne. Around me the crowd moved on, their focus fixed on the next item, the next performance of wealth. But I sat still, my silence heavier than the room's applause. I remembered the bridges I had raised, the beams I had lifted into the sky, the structures that still stood because of me. Men like these drank their wine under roofs I had built, walked across marble floors held up by my foundations, yet none of them knew my name, and my son, my own flesh and blood, preferred to keep it that way. He was content for them to believe I was nobody. That betrayal did not come with shouts or accusations. It came quietly, steadily, in the way he chose absence over truth. And yet, beneath the sting of being unseen, something stirred inside me, like a coal refusing to die. He thought his silence could erase me, but I carried in my bones a story that no curtain of shame could hide. My life was written in steel and stone, in sweat and sacrifice, in a masterpiece that bore my mark so deeply it could not be stripped away. He thought he could rise while keeping me in shadow, but he had built his whole illusion on the very work he wanted to forget. And when that work finally spoke, when the curtain lifted, his silence would no longer matter. The truth would roar louder than his laughter, and in that roar he would face not just his father, but the legacy he had tried so desperately to bury. The sound of the gavel cracked through the hall, sharper than before, carrying with it a weight that silenced the restless murmurs. Forks lowered, glasses stilled, and the audience shifted as one body, leaning forward in anticipation. The auctioneer's voice changed, lower, slower, laced with gravity. And now, our centerpiece for the evening. Those words alone were enough to draw every gaze toward the stage, as if what was hidden there had the power to define the entire night. A ripple of excitement ran through the room, a current of hunger that pulled every polished guest closer to the edge of their seats. I saw my son straighten in that moment, his back rising tall, his chest swelling with unearned pride. He smoothed his tie, adjusted his cufflinks, and allowed a practiced smile to settle on his face. To him, this unveiling was not about the art, not about the work that would stand beneath the lights, but about himself. He imagined the gasps of admiration, the applause, the nods of approval from men who would now see him as more than a guest at their table. He was certain this moment would confirm his place among them, that he would finally be recognized as one of their own. Pride radiated from him, but it was pride born of a lie, a belief that what was about to be revealed belonged to him. The crowd whispered, speculating on what masterpiece could command such reverence. They spoke of rare painters, of collectors known for hoarding treasures, of sculptors whose works lived in museums. Their voices carried excitement, but also greed, the anticipation of bidding not only for beauty, but for power, for possession, for the right to display something others could not. In their eyes, this was not just art, it was status made visible. My son basked in that atmosphere, already rehearsing the conversations he would have when the curtain fell. He believed he would leave this room with glory clinging to him, with envy following his steps like a shadow. But as I watched him, a silence settled over me that was different from theirs, for I alone knew what was waiting behind the velvet drape. I alone carried the truth in my chest like a secret heartbeat. What they imagined was nothing compared to the reality, a creation born not of wealth, but of labor, not of inheritance, but of sacrifice. The hands that had built it were the same hands my son now wished hidden in the shadows. He thought the centerpiece was his triumph, his crowning jewel. He had no idea it was my life's work, my soul poured into form, my name carved where it could never be erased. The auctioneer paused, letting the tension stretch until it felt as though the walls themselves leaned in to listen. The velvet curtain stood still, but to me it already trembled with the weight of what it concealed. My son smiled wider, believing the moment belonged to him, yet in the deepest part of me, I knew, when the unveiling came, it would not shine light on him. It would burn straight through the silence he had forced upon me. The room waited for beauty, I waited for justice, and in a matter of seconds, both would arrive together. The curtain rose slowly, the velvet folding upward as if the fabric itself understood the weight of what it revealed. For a heartbeat, the hall seemed to inhale together, one vast breath suspended in the glittering air. And then it was there, my work, my life, my silent testament standing tall under the chandeliers. Gasps burst through the room like sparks leaping from a fire, scattered, uncontainable. Some clutched their chests, others leaned forward, eyes wide, whispers tumbling through the silence that could no longer hold them. It was not the admiration of wealth or status that filled the room. It was awe, sudden and raw, the kind that comes only when beauty meets truth. There it stood, the design I had dreamed in solitude, the craft I had built in nights where no one watched, the labor of decades that had stripped skin from bone, but left creation in its place. Every line, every curve, every polished surface bore not just skill, but devotion. It was not a relic passed down through hands that never touched sweat. It was not a treasure borrowed from another man's genius. It was mine, a child of dust and fire, raised from nothing but vision and endurance, poured into shape until my soul itself had weight and form. I had carried this in silence, hidden from the world that dismissed me, but now it stood undeniable. The chandeliers caught its edges and made it glow, as if the very light had bent to serve it. The crowd murmured words that barely touched its surface. Magnificent, unlike anything, masterful, but none of them knew the price of it, the years it had consumed, the nights it had stolen from my youth. I knew. Every mark etched into it was a scar of my own life. Every shining detail was a piece of my spirit set free. This was not art to me. It was survival made eternal, dignity forged into something that could not be erased. I glanced at my son. His smile had not yet faded, but it had faltered. He clapped politely, eyes darting, trying to claim the moment before the truth swallowed it whole. He wanted them to think it reflected on him, that it was part of his shine. But I could see the flicker in his face, the twitch at the corner of his mouth, the sudden weight in his posture. He had spent years keeping me in the shadows, years ensuring no one knew what I had built, and now, in front of everyone. The shadow had stepped into the light. The hall buzzed with wonder, but beneath the wonder was something else, a shift. They were no longer looking only at the masterpiece. Their eyes were searching the room, searching for the name, the hand, the soul behind it. And when they found me, when recognition passed from one guest to the next, I felt the silence he had wrapped around me begin to tear. I was no longer invisible. My work had spoken louder than his silence ever could. And though no word had yet been uttered, I knew the truth was already spreading like fire. This was not his triumph. It was mine. The applause that had erupted when the curtain first rose did not last long. It thinned, trembled, and then collapsed into a hush so heavy it pressed against the marble walls. People leaned forward in their seats, not in excitement now, but in reverence, as if noise itself would be an insult to what stood before them. The chandelier light trembled on the polished surface of my work, casting shifting shadows that seemed alive, almost breathing. You could hear the faintest sound, the creak of a chair, the rustle of silk, but beneath it all was silence, a silence thick with realization. My son was the only one who did not lean forward. He sat frozen, his face drained of its careful composure. His hands, always so quick to adjust his cufflinks or brush invisible lint from his lapel, lay stiff on his knees. The mask he had worn all night, the smile, the charm, the confidence, cracked without a sound. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't prepared for the weight of what the velvet had hidden. He had thought the centerpiece would be another prize to flaunt, another jewel to polish his reputation. But this was no ornament. This was revelation. And revelation has no mercy. My eyes traveled across the room, and I saw the moment of recognition bloom like dawn on every face. First wonder, then curiosity, then the search. Who had made this? Whose soul had been poured into the shape before them? And then, slowly, their gazes found me. One by one their eyes turned. No announcement had yet been spoken, no words carved into the air, but they already sensed the truth. It was there in the silence, in the way I sat unmoving, in the way the masterpiece seemed to echo something deeper than money could buy. And still, my son did not move. He clung to the hope that silence could protect him, that if he stayed composed, the ownership would somehow remain unspoken. But I knew better. The silence was not his shield. It was the storm gathering around him, waiting for the strike that would split the night open. Because at the heart of the masterpiece, where no curtain could hide, my name was there, not hidden, not disguised, carved deep, etched in a place no hand could erase. It was not just a signature. It was my life, branded into truth. I could feel the heat of that moment rising, filling the air like thunder before lightning. The audience did not yet know the story, but they were seconds from hearing it, seconds from the revelation that would tear apart the mask my son had so carefully crafted. And as the auctioneer stepped forward again, his hand brushing the edge of the podium, ready to speak the name that had always belonged to me, I felt a calm settle over me like armor. The storm was coming, but it was my storm, and once it broke, no silence, no shame, no denial could hold me in the shadows again. The auctioneer cleared his throat, and even that small sound felt like the tightening of a bowstring before it was loosed. His eyes scanned the crowd, lingering on the faces bent forward, hungry for the name behind the work. He drew in a breath, and when he spoke, his voice carried with a weight that filled the hall and pressed into every corner. Created by... For the briefest second, time stood still. My son's hands tightened against his knees, knuckles pale, his jaw locked, as if he could will the words into silence. But silence had no power here. The truth surged past him, unstoppable. The auctioneer spoke my name, not his, not anyone else's, mine. The syllables reverberated against the walls, breaking through the polished air of wealth and pretense. It was not a polite mention, not a footnote, but a declaration. Spoken aloud in a hall that had tried to erase me, it rang like a bell that could not be unrung. The reaction was immediate and electric. Heads turned as one, not in dismissal this time, not with the casual glance they had spared me earlier. No, their eyes fixed on me with the piercing clarity of recognition. In that moment, I was no longer the man seated in the shadows, tolerated but unseen. I was the creator, the mind and the hand that had birthed what silenced them now. The room itself seemed to shift, as though the light had bent in my direction. Every face reflected something different: surprise, admiration, shame, envy. Whispers rippled like wind across grass. My name repeated, carried from one table to another until it no longer belonged only to me, but to the air itself. And in those whispers, I heard the undoing of my son's careful facade. He had worked so hard to keep me hidden, to shrink me down to nothing more than my father, an afterthought at the edge of his glow. But with a single announcement, that illusion crumbled. His borrowed pride scattered like dust, replaced by the undeniable truth of where the brilliance in the room truly stood. I did not rise, did not bow, did not gesture for attention. I simply remained where I was, 2 rows back, in the place they had tried to bury me. And still, every gaze reached me. For the first time in years, I felt the weight of my name not as a burden, but as a crown. This was not pity. This was not courtesy. It was recognition, the kind that cannot be faked, the kind earned only by work that outlives the silence surrounding it. My heart beat steady, not with triumph, but with something quieter, deeper, a justice long delayed, now delivered in the clearest voice. I glanced toward my son. His face was rigid, his smile gone, his eyes wide with the panic of a man watching the walls collapse around him. He could not undo what had been spoken. He could not take back the truth. And as the hall filled with the sound of my name, as it echoed in mouths that had once ignored me, I knew this night had shifted forever. I had been invisible. Now, I was unforgettable. A low wave of murmurs rolled across the hall, like the first rumble of thunder before a storm. Some leaned close to their neighbors, whispering my name as though testing the sound of it, astonished that it belonged to the man seated in the shadows. Others straightened in their chairs, eyes bright with admiration, hands breaking into hesitant applause that grew with each passing second. The clapping began in scattered bursts, awkward at first, but then stronger, spreading through the room until the silence could not contain it. Each strike of palm against palm was not just praise for the masterpiece, but acknowledgement of the one who had forged it. My name, once buried, now moved from lip to lip, rising above the clinking of glasses, above the echoes of wealth, louder even than the chandeliers trembling overhead. And still, at the center of it all, sat my son. His face flushed deep crimson, not from pride, but from shame, burning hotter than he could hide. He tried to hold his composure, tried to smile faintly, as though this revelation did not wound him. But the mask slipped with every second. His lips tightened, his eyes darted toward me, and in them I saw the terror of a man who had built his place on fragile glass, now shattered by a truth too powerful to silence. He could not command the room anymore. He could not look away, and neither could anyone else. The applause did not die down quickly. It grew, echoing against marble and crystal, building into something that felt like justice itself taking shape. Men who had ignored me earlier now studied me with new respect, their gazes heavy, acknowledging silently what they had failed to see. Women who had dismissed me as a background figure now leaned forward, curiosity and admiration alive in their faces. I was no longer invisible. I was not the guest in the shadows. I was the man whose work had stilled their voices, whose name now demanded their attention. For my son, the weight of those eyes must have been unbearable. Every gaze that turned toward me turned away from him, stripping him of the shine he had tried to steal. Every whisper of my name was another crack in the story he had told them, another reminder that he was not the source of brilliance, but merely its beneficiary. His shame filled the room as tangibly as the applause. an invisible fire that consumed him while I sat still, calm, rooted in the quiet strength of truth. And as I listened to my name ring out, rising above the din, I realized something more profound than pride. This was not only my vindication, it was my son's reckoning. For years he had tried to shape me into silence, to cut me down so he might stand taller. But tonight, before a hall of witnesses, the truth he buried had risen, unshakable, undeniable. He could not silence it, not tonight, not in this room, not ever again. My name was louder than his shame, and it would remain so long after the last applause faded into memory. The first bid came timidly, almost like a hand testing the surface of cold water. A voice from the front row lifted the number, and the auctioneer's gavel struck once, sharp and alive. Then another hand shot up, bolder, stronger, as if to claim the air itself. The masterpiece, once unveiled, had not only stolen their breath, it had ignited their hunger. Bids climbed rapidly, numbers spilling into the room like rising waves. 50,000, 75, 100. Each call was louder, faster, until the auctioneer's voice became a drumbeat, his rhythm matched by the heartbeat in my chest. They weren't simply buying an object. They were grasping at a legacy, clawing to hold a piece of something that had already proven itself eternal. I sat motionless, my eyes steady on the stage, but inside me something trembled, not weakness, but the fierce tremor of justice fulfilled. For every number that soared higher, another stone was placed upon the grave of my son's illusion. He had told me not to embarrass him, had shoved me into corners, had silenced my name as though it were dust, and now that same name lifted the value of the night, commanding sums that left even the most seasoned bidders gasping. With each rise in price, his story collapsed further. What he had labeled as embarrassment, the crowd now called priceless. What he had treated as a burden, they fought over as treasure. I turned my eyes toward him, and the sight was almost unbearable in its clarity. He sat rigid, his knuckles white as his hands clenched against his thighs. His eyes darted between the stage and the guests, throwing out numbers with fervor. He tried to smile, tried to keep the mask intact, but his lips twitched under the weight of truth. Every dollar spoken aloud was another reminder that he could no longer hide me, no longer diminish what I had built. The world was placing value not on him, but on me, on the work of my hands, on the years of labor he had dismissed as shame. The bids climbed higher still, the air alive with the fever of desire. Two guests locked eyes across the room, their voices clashing in a duel of wealth. The numbers leapt in thousands, each one echoing like thunder, and in that thunder I heard vindication. They weren't buying what was fashionable. They weren't chasing a passing trend. They were fighting for permanence, for a work that could not be erased. They were fighting, without even realizing it, for my story. The gavel paused mid-air, the auctioneer's voice triumphant as he called the final number. Gasps rippled through the hall, applause crackled like lightning, and the masterpiece was claimed, not as an object, but as proof. Proof that what my son had hidden was worthy of worship. Proof that the man he had tried to reduce to silence had, in truth, created something that no silence could contain. In that instant, wealth itself had bent to acknowledge me. My legacy was not embarrassment. It was inheritance. It was survival transfigured into beauty. It was dignity given a price the world could no longer ignore. And as the applause rose again, shaking the chandeliers, I did not move. I did not need to. The price of truth had been paid, and it was higher than any of them had imagined. My name had been carved into history, not by my son's permission, but by the undeniable weight of my work. The hall belonged to me now, not in ownership, but in truth. And my son, burning red in the front row, had no choice but to watch as the world bowed to the man he had tried to erase. The first bid landed like a spark, and then another followed, brighter, louder, until the room itself felt as though it were catching fire. Numbers rose into the air with urgency, each one higher than the last, climbing a staircase built on desire and awe. 50,000, 75, 100. The auctioneer's voice sharpened, quickening as if he were barely able to keep pace with the fever of the room. Hands shot upward with reckless determination, the wealthy clawing at one another for a chance to own what they believed would make them eternal. My masterpiece was no longer a piece of art. It had become a battlefield of pride, a mirror through which they measured their own worth. And I sat there, unmoving, as though nailed to my chair, while inside me something vast began to stir. For every number they shouted, every gasp that followed, I felt the weight of years lifting from my shoulders. My son's carefully constructed world, built on shame, on dismissal, on the quiet exile of his own father, was crumbling with each rising bid. What he had treated as a blemish, what he had hidden like a family secret too ugly to expose, was now the very thing the world fought for. With every new sum, the story rewrote itself. His lie shriveled, and my truth grew wings. I turned my eyes to him, and the sight was almost painful in its clarity. His face was a mask, breaking from within, his lips pressed so tightly together they had lost all color. He shifted in his chair as though the seat itself burned him. He wanted to vanish, but there was no place left to hide. Every sound of my name on the auctioneer's tongue was a stone striking his chest. Every gasp from the crowd was another reminder that he was not the source of the legacy he had paraded, but merely a man borrowing shine from a father he had tried to erase. He had told me not to embarrass him, but what unfolded before him was worse than embarrassment. It was exposure. The bids climbed higher still. Two rivals locked eyes across the hall, voices overlapping in a frenzy. The auctioneer barely had time to point before another hand shot up, desperate, commanding, determined. The numbers leapt into the hundreds of thousands, and the room itself seemed to tremble under the weight of the frenzy. And I, the man who had once been seated in silence, the man who had been pushed 2 rows back, now found my legacy crashing over them like a tide. The truth was no longer something to be spoken. It was being shouted in numbers, in gasps, in the very hunger of the room. At last, the auctioneer's gavel hovered high, his voice booming with triumph as he called the final bid. The hall stilled, breathless, the silence charged with awe. When the gavel fell, it struck not only the podium, but the coffin of my son's pretense. Applause thundered, rattling the chandeliers, rolling through the marble like justice itself had taken form. They weren't only applauding wealth, they were applauding me, though many had not even known my face an hour ago. They were applauding the life carved into that masterpiece, the work, the sacrifice, the hands that had forged it. And in that moment, I understood something greater than victory. This was not about money, not about ownership. It was about truth finally stepping into the light. My son's warning, "Don't embarrass me tonight," echoed faintly in my mind, but it was no longer a chain. It was broken glass, lying at my feet. Because I had not embarrassed him, I had revealed him. The world saw the truth, and in that truth, I was no longer the shadow. I was the fire. The gavel fell with a crack that seemed to split the night open, and the sound was met with an eruption of applause that rolled across the hall like thunder. Men and women rose slightly from their seats, their hands striking together, their faces lit with admiration and wonder. The masterpiece had been claimed, but it was more than the sale that set their palms ablaze. It was the revelation of what it meant, of who stood behind it. My name carried through their voices, repeated in murmurs, in astonished tones, in recognition that tasted like justice. For the first time in that gilded room, I was not the quiet man seated in the back. I was the creator, the master, the source of awe that none of them could look away from. And yet, in the midst of that ovation, my son sat frozen. He did not join them. His hand, so quick earlier to polish his image with easy gestures and rehearsed charm, now clung desperately to his lap. His fists clenched until his knuckles whitened, holding tight to the last shards of his pride as though he could keep them from slipping through his fingers. He stared straight ahead, his lips pressed thin, refusing to acknowledge what everyone else had already seen. He was drowning in a room filled with light, the weight of my name dragging him down while the world around him celebrated. The applause did not fade quickly. It grew, echoing off marble walls, bouncing from chandelier to chandelier, until the very building seemed to recognize me. I sat still, not lifting a hand, not bowing, not even smiling. I did not need to. For years I had lived in silence, carrying the shame he placed on me like a chain around my neck. Now, without a word, that silence had turned into strength. My work spoke, my name carried, and every cheer was another stone laid upon the foundation of a truth that could no longer be denied. Guests began to glance between me and my son, the contrast sharp and merciless. On one side, the man who had been hidden, revealed at last as the builder, the dreamer, the master. On the other, the son who had tried to bury him, now exposed in his smallness, stripped of the pride he had borrowed. I could see it in their eyes, pity not for me, but for him. They knew the truth. They saw the betrayal for what it was. They understood that he had tried to silence a legacy, and in doing so, had damned himself to stand in its shadow forever. The weight of my name settled over the room like a mantle. It no longer belonged only to me. It belonged to the masterpiece, to the applause, to the memory of everyone who witnessed this night. My son could clench his fists until his bones cracked, but he could not hold back what had already been unleashed. My name would outlast his shame. My legacy would stand where his pride had fallen. And as the applause swelled once more, I felt the quiet truth burn in my chest. I was no longer invisible. I was eternal. When the evening drew to its end, and the last glasses were emptied, I rose quietly from my seat. I did not wait for anyone to escort me, did not linger for more applause, did not search the crowd for approval. The hall was still humming with the aftershocks of revelation. My name whispered in clusters, repeated in astonishment, spoken like a secret that had suddenly become fact. I walked slowly toward the exit, each step steady, each breath lighter than the one before. My son sat at the main table, his shoulders hunched, his eyes fixed on nothing. I did not look at him. I did not need to. The distance between us was no longer measured in steps, but in truth. And truth had already spoken louder than I ever could. The marble floor beneath me echoed my stride, and with every sound I felt years of silence fall away. For so long I had carried the weight of being unseen, of being hidden like a flaw behind polished walls. Tonight that weight had broken. Tonight the hall itself had borne witness to who I was. My work had stood under the chandeliers, more radiant than the gold on their necks or the silk draped across their shoulders. My name had rung out in a place that had once dismissed me, and the echo of it clung to the air even as the night faded. It would linger there long after the music died, long after the guests returned to their lives of pretense. My truth had rooted itself into the very bones of that hall. Outside, the night air was cool against my face, and I drew it in like a man finally free of chains. I thought of his warning, "Don't embarrass me tonight," and the bitterness of those words no longer cut me. They only reminded me of how small his fear had been compared to the vastness of what was revealed. I had not embarrassed him. I had not needed to raise my voice, nor defend my place, nor demand their eyes. I had simply let the work of my life speak, and in speaking, it had roared louder than shame, louder than lies, louder than his trembling pride. The doors of the hall closed softly behind me, but I knew that inside my name was still alive, passed from table to table, remembered by every face that had witnessed the unveiling. I did not carry bitterness as I walked into the night. What I carried was something far stronger, the knowledge that dignity, once revealed, cannot be silenced again. My son's shame would fade, as all shallow things do, but my truth, my work, my legacy would stand longer than his pride, longer than his silence, longer than this single night. When I walked away from that place, I did not look back. I didn't need to. The hall still echoed with my name, my work, my truth. And though my son had tried to hide me, to shrink me, to command me into shadows, he could not undo what had been carved into stone and steel, into fire and blood, into the masterpiece that bore my soul. Justice had stood that night, taller than chandeliers, brighter than gold, stronger than shame. And as I disappeared into the darkness, I carried with me the one victory that could never be stolen. I had reminded the world who I was.